Hello, everybody, and welcome to BeerSmith episode number 30. We've got Randy Mosher on the show today. He's going to talk about designing beer. And we've also got some news with BeerSmith 2. I've got BeerSmith 2 available on the Amazon store now. So if you go to Amazon.com and just type in BeerSmith 2, you'll find it pretty quickly. I want to mention our sponsor for this week's show is More Beer at beersmith.com/morebeer. If you go to the webpage, beersmith.com/morebeer, and use the order links there, you'll be supporting the show, which is always appreciated. And now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's interview with Randy Mosher. Today on the show, I welcome Randy Mosher, the author of Radical Brewing at radicalbrewing.com. He's also working on a new book called The Handy Book of Homebrewing. Randy and I are going to spend a few minutes today talking about beer recipe design. Randy, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. It's great to be here, as always.
It's always good having you back. I think this is your third time on the show? Third time now?
Something like that.
Something like that, yeah. Randy, we're going to talk a little bit about recipe design today, and which is closely related, I guess, to your new book. Now, recipe design usually starts with some kind of idea or inspiration. Where do you get your ideas or inspiration for making a new beer?
It really depends upon what I'm trying to do. For myself to just drink, I often really think a lot about the seasons and about what I want. I mean, I find more and more, I find myself trying to drink beers that kind of suit a particular season. And I guess when I start thinking about brewing them, that's one of the things I'm looking at.
So can you give me a couple examples? What kind of seasonal ties do you have? I mean, for example, I prefer darker beers in the winter, but
darker beers, stronger beers, richer beers, sweeter beers, heavier kind of beers in the winter. Those seem to just suit me real fine. Starts to be getting towards late winter, and I start thinking about something a little paler and something a little bit still a bit strong. I mean, a Maibach I think is like the perfect spring beer, but I've done Belgian Maibachs, I've done Belgian wheat Maibachs, I've done lots of different variations on those kinds of things. Strong white beers, kind of heavy, slightly sweet saisons. Anything along those lines seems to work for me in the spring.
And what do you do in the summer and the fall?
Summer, it's got to be a wit beer. That's just a great style. I love that. I love the style. I love the complexity of it. I love the challenge of trying to make them well. It's a beer that beer style I think is fairly difficult to brew correctly, and to get that right balance of low alcohol beer that has this huge creamy flavor and texture. Get the spicing, not only the quantity of the spicing but the character of the spicing really working well, and getting all the spices to kind of work together, augment the yeast, and not be hitting you over the head with the coriander hammer.
Yeah, I enjoy a good wit beer as well.
Yeah. It's a magical thing. I think it's one of beer world's great wonders is a really great wit beer.
So can you walk us through the basic process you might use to design a new beer? Let's say you start with a blank sheet of paper. Where do you go from there?
Well, blank sheet of paper, and then you start really kind of thinking about what that concept is. And I almost, because I'm a marketing guy and do packaging and things like that, I often start with kind of the description that you might put on a beer bottle, and certainly when I'm doing recipes for commercial clients, that's where we start and try and think about, what is the idea here? It's helpful to have a kind of a big idea that you can drive everything else with. So if you're thinking about that maybe an early summer, late spring beer, maybe it's a certain kind of cream ale. That's a beer style. I sort of cut my drinking teeth on cream ale in Cincinnati. Drank a lot of Little Kings back when I was in college, and it was crappy beer then, but there's something about the idea of it. So maybe the idea is a creamy cream ale, right? So what does that actually mean? And how would you look at all of the recipe parameters, all the process decisions to make that? And, first of all, you want to make sure your water's correct and nice and clean, because if you have anything creamy, if you got astringent or harsh elements in there, it's going to kill that creamy buzz, right? So that's something really important. You want to really have a neutral, you want to make sure that you do things positively, but you're also trying to avoid things that would be negative to your concept. So nice clean water. Think about the malt specifically. What would give you a creamy, smooth taste, and that pale color. I mean, you got to be Pilsner malt for a base, because anything else is going to start to get a little too like raspy. Maybe pale ale malt has a bit of an edge to it, which is what's great about bitters, but it's something you don't want, is something super creamy, I think. And so Pils malt, you might think about, well, do I want an American Pils malt? I want a German Pils malt. Kind of depends on how much malt flavor you want. You're going to get a little bit more out of the German or European malts just because of the barley strains and the way they're malted. Seems to be the case. Then you start thinking about, on the one hand, you're looking at the range of possible adjuncts to kind of add that creaminess. So, you start going through the Rolodex in your mind. Okay, well, what could do that? Well, I could do it with unmalted barley like Guinness does. I could do it with wheat. I could do it with oats. I could do it even with rye if I wanted like creamy, spicy. I might be thinking about rye. So I pull some of those grains in, and that gives my creamy component. But then I want to think about, well, how can I take this Pilsner malt and make it more complex? So you might look at tiny quantities of like a 20 love caramel malt. I'm generally I'm not a person that uses caramel malt every time. I think that's people use it a lot out of habit and don't realize what a distinctive flavor it has. But I think it obviously has some really great uses. Another way to keep a pale colored beer but add a lot of flavors, to drop some Vienna in addition to the Pils malt. You can do about 20% Vienna, and you kind of go in terms of what the beer looks like from being a German type of Pils to a Czech type of Pils. So you can really get a little bit of that sort of golden shimmer. 10-20% Vienna malt, it really ramps up that soft, delicate, caramely flavor. And in pale beer, you don't have a huge number of options of different things to do as far as the grain bill. And then, you're thinking about the hop bitterness too, and you want to think about, again, trying to avoid doing anything that's going to upset that creaminess. So you don't want to drop a bunch of, I don't know, Chinook in there, something like that. It just would really kind of defeat the whole purpose. So look for a hop that's elegant. You might sort of automatically think about using a European noble hop, but there's lots of other hops these days. I'm a big fan of Glacier right now for that kind of purpose. It sort of has somewhat of a Styrian character, I think, which is hard to say exactly what that is, but somewhere on the other side of Saaz in terms of that sort of spicy quality that we assign to Saaz, but it's super clean and really always just tastes really good. And I also find a lot of fun with New Zealand hops these days. There's some really fantastic hop varieties. I'm just starting to play with them, but having a lot of fun with that. So then you make your process decisions, and everything you do, from the malt, from the mashing to the boil to everything else. If you always have to keep going back to what that basic idea is, because you have so many decisions to make during brewing, and if you just sort of make them arbitrarily, it's without this driving idea, it really becomes difficult to put something together that comes off as a whole thing.
So you started out, though, you started the discussion with sort of a style guideline. You said you were going to brew a cream ale in this case.
Right.
How would what role does a BJCP style guide or even another style guide play in determining the overall design for your beer?
For me, not all that much.
Not that much. Radical brewing.
If you're brewing for a competition, then they're everything.
Yeah.
Well, they're not everything, but they're the strike zone, right? It's it's basically you've got parameters, and in order to have your beer worthy of consideration, you first have to make sure that the color, the gravity, the bitterness, all these basic aspects of the beer more or less match up what's in the style guidelines. Then you have to kind of give it a soul. That soul matches the personality of the soul of an English beer or the soul of a German beer. Those are subtle things like really the specific maltsters and where the origin of the malt comes from has a little bit to do with it. Certainly hops are a huge thing, and yeast as well. Belgian beer is nothing special until you add the yeast, and then it becomes Belgian beer. Mm-hmm.
So can you walk us through, let's start at the very beginning, though. You started with grains, for example.
Right.
How do you go about choosing the base malt, and what are some examples of some base malts that you enjoy using?
It really depends on what you're trying to do. One of the things I like to do with base malts is to try and get as much color as I can get in my beer from the base malts, right? So I'm not a big fan of stout recipes that use a lot of pale malt, mm-hmm. right? Because that pale malt is kind of lost in there. And if you want to have flavor all the way through at every level, at every part of the kind of color flavor range of malt, you really need to use some malt that's going to give you a little bit better flavor out of your base. So for a stout, I'd certainly look at a mild ale malt, right, to begin with. Mm-hmm. I think that's a bit underutilized style, or underutilized
base malt.
Base malt. I don't think people really are all that aware of that base malt out there. And, it certainly has a lot of historical precedent. And when you brew with it, you really get a kind of a rich caramelly underpinning that you miss when you brew with pale ale malt. And if you can't get mild, you can certainly get Vienna or a lighter Munich will do the job pretty well. And then I'd be looking at Munich. Munich malt's certainly not traditional for a stout, but there's it has a wonderful flavor, and if your certain kind of stout would bear some of that sort of toasted caramel cookie kind of flavor that Munich malt can have. So I'm a big fan of kind of looking beyond those one or two key specialty malt that are sort of signature for the style and digging down underneath and using your base malt to add a lot of depth and complexity. I think that's really a secret to making great beer.
Fantastic. In your new book, I know you sent me some graphics out of your new book explaining how different ingredients, especially different specialty malts, really drive different flavors. I was hoping you could give us a few examples or maybe a preview out of your new book of some of the things that you've noted with applying, taking a recipe and applying these specialty malts to the grain bill.
So yeah, I mean, it's all part of that. It's all part of that thing. I mean, you're looking at trying to this way, yeah. You're looking at trying to get the maximum amount of flavor in your beer and use every little trick in the book that you can. So again, you think about each beer in terms of sort of 3 or 4 different groups that might go into it. It gets a little confusing when you go to the homebrew shop and you look at the shelf and there's 30 different kinds of malt there. And people start throwing stuff in their recipes. They put in some crystal malt because that's what they always do. Then maybe a different crystal malt, then maybe some chocolate malt, and stuff gets sort of tossed in willy-nilly. I mean, I've seen a lot of recipes. And so I'm trying to get people to think about putting the recipes together in blocks, right? So let's think about a red beer, for example. Mm-hmm. You may have there's like 4 or 5 different possible blocks for a red beer. So the block you always kind of start thinking about first is your base malt. So in a red beer, you can use almost anything except something super dark as a base. You can do Pils, you can do Pale, you can do Munich, and you could even do a bunch of amber if you wanted to. And so you start thinking about those and think about what you might want as a base. Do you want it really super clean and let all the specialty malts do the heavy lifting? In which case you might want a Pils. If you want a slight toasty edge, you might go for a pale ale malt. Do you want something more caramelly, more cookie? In which case you might lean towards a Munich. So you make a decision about your base, and you can mix those up, of course. And then you think about, all right, what do I want to get that red color from? Now, and especially that red flavor, because that red flavor is really pretty distinctive flavor that comes from 80 Lovibond caramel. You know, that dark crystal malt just has that really intense roasted marshmallow, burnt sugar kind of flavor to it. And if you don't have that in a red ale, it's kind of not a red ale, you know, as far as what's out there and what people are going to expect to find in a red ale. I don't know if that's in the BJCP guidelines or not, but for me, that's the key. And it just so happens that those darker caramel malts also are one of the redder shades of malt that you can get, right? So then you put in however much of that malt that you think the flavor will bear based on what you've got in your base malt. So if you're using a Pils malt, you probably need a little bit more of that reddish caramel crystal malt. If you're using a Munich malt, probably a little bit less. Then you start thinking, you go sort of to the other side and think about, all right, what kind of adjunct character do I want this beer to have? Is there something I want to do with the texture of the beer that I need to use an adjunct for? So again, mostly those sorts of creamy kinds of things. If you want to thin the body out, you can use some sugar. If you want to add creaminess, again, the wheat, oats, rye. You know, a lot of people are using rye in their reds today. It's almost become probably the most important sub-style of red is these red rye, hoppy red rye beers. That's really have emerged in the last 5 or 10 years as kind of the dominant style, I think, on those reds. So, you know, if you want to go with the flow, then use some rye. If not, look at something else. And then you go back, at some point you got to start totting up all the color, trying to brew a beer with 3 or 4 different kinds of malts in it that are all different colors. You have to do some color calculation because it's just too hard to take a guess at it. So you have to kind of add up the numbers, add them all up, divide by gallons, and there's sort of a little sliding scale that you can use to turn these sort of homebrew color units into actual predicted color units.
Yeah, some more equation.
Software like you have.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, a lot of the software does those color calculations, and they're none of them accurate. Everybody knows that. They're not real science. But, you know, every BJCP category has a range of about, you know, a 2-to-1 ratio, so that you can be off by 50% in your color and you're still in the style, right? So you have, even if you can get 10 or 20% predictability, you know, accuracy in your predictions, that's good enough for what we're trying to do. So you add up all the color, you look at where you're at, you look at where the guidelines are at, or where you want to be in terms of the color of the beer, and then you may have to adjust for color. And best way to do that is some really dark malt. You might, with a red ale, look at one of the German roast malt types, things like the Carafa malts, because those are debittered and huskless, and you can add color without really adding a great deal of flavor, and certainly nothing harsh or rough. And so you have a nice, smooth, clean flavor. And they are also red. So if you're looking again for that red color, it's a good idea to throw a little bit of black malt in there, or these debittered black malts, because they're going to add a little bit to that red shade. Yeah,
and a lot of people use roasted malt to give it a little bit of red tint as well. Use just a very small
that's
amount.
what I'm talking about, that roast malt, the German roast malts.
Yeah.
Because that is the reddish shade. So you just, you know, look at where your numbers are before you add that, figure out how much more color you want, and drop a little bit of that in, and you're good to go.
Well, hops also play a critical role here. How do you actually go about picking which hop variety to use? It's almost the same situation you have with malts. There's dozens to pick from, certainly.
Yeah, there's I you know, in this new book I've got 78 different hop varieties in it.
Yeah.
And you know, that represents, I think, kind of everything that you're going to ever run into in a online catalog, or have somebody tell you that they used in New Zealand or something. So you know, obviously you can't get everything, and there's a bunch more that are out there in the world that I didn't, you know, not talking about. But that is a lot of hops. One of the things I've tried to do in this new book is to group hops together into groups according to what their flavors are. And so, you know, I've got a group for, I call Cascadian. And of course that's, you know, Cascade, that's Cascade at one end, And I think Simcoe's at the other end with Autumnum and Amarillo and Columbus and a bunch of those hops kind of, forming a lineup from really racy and cat pea all the way down to kind of those more passion fruit, tropical, apricot flavors of Simcoe. And I was kind of surprised when I started organizing these hops that they kind of lined up into groups, and the groups almost lined up in ways you could almost put the whole hop world into a wheel. But I thought putting them by groups was helpful, and it helps to put these hops side by side so that people will, because you're never going to be able to get every hop you want, whether you're a small brewer or large brewer these days. It's just the fact of life in the hop shortages that we're in. So you have to be able to make substitutions. And of course, it's also good to need to do that sometimes, because if you're just in a habit of using one hop over and over and over again, it's good to branch out and try some other things. You might find some you like better. So, generally I'm using neutral hops for bittering. Mm-hmm. My hopping has gotten a lot simpler. I used to do 4 or 5 varieties and 3 or 4 additions and just like kind of make it crazy like that. But really, I don't find much benefit to more than just 2 or 3 varieties and doing maybe two or maybe 3 additions. Anything more than that is just sort of, I just don't find that you're really going to taste the difference. Yeah, so I'm looking mostly for a really neutral hop for bittering, something that's just going to stay out of the way. Maybe add a kind of push the hopping in a certain direction, whether it's kind of dry and neutral and herbal, or whether it's bright and tangy and sharp, or New World or Old World or New Zealand, and then be careful and lay those aromatic varieties on top, load them up at the end. One of the things I like to do also with hops is to look at my total bitterness units and divide it into percentages, and make my decisions on how much hop quantity to use based on the percentages. Mm-hmm. So if I've got an addition at an hour, an addition at 10 minutes, and an addition at the end, and I say I'm going to get half my IBUs from the beginning and half my IBUs from the end, that means I probably got 3 to 6 times as much hops in that final charge, my 10-minute charge, to get to the same BUs as I'm going to get to in the hops that I've had in there for an hour. And so thinking in terms of those proportions takes some of the guesswork out of hop aroma, in the sense that you now have some ratio, because otherwise it's just, I'm going to throw in these hops, an ounce, 2 ounces, 3 ounces, just sort of based on what your experience has been. But if you're actually calculating bitterness units, you have some number that you can go back to and some sort of ratio. And the higher alpha hops do tend to have more aroma. It's not absolute, and there's a lot of variability. But a 10 alpha hop, you're just going to have a lot more everything, a lot more resin, a lot more oil, a lot more everything than you are in a 2 or 3, like a Sots or something. So there's some reasonableness to doing that it's somewhat proportional.
So which groups of hops are your go-to hops for finishing an aroma?
Well, again, that's such a matter of what the beer style is. To me, that finishing hop is sort of the soul. So if you're trying to make an English tasting beer, you don't want to be digging around with a lot of noble hops. It just doesn't really make all that much sense. So you be looking at English varieties, the Kent Goldings and the classics and stuff like that. But there's a lot of other interesting English hops if you can get their hands on them. And then there's other hops. There's North American hops, like North American Fuggles, with like Styrians, like even some of these New Zealand hops have certain characteristics that you can slip in to an English style beer and still have an overall English character, but use these hops from other places to give it just a little bit of a twist, which is often kind of fun too. Often something you want to try and do. So.
Now, what about yeast? Obviously, yeast adds somewhere between 400 and 500 different flavors to the beer, at least according to Chris White. How do you go about picking the yeast that you need?
Yeah, he's not wrong about that. That's an area that I'm not as expert in as I would like to be. Yeast is a lot of hidden stuff. Each strain you use, every time you use it, you learn something new. It does something different at every temperature. It does something different with every type of beer. I think yeast is one of those things that the longer you brew, the more beers you make. Yeast is just something that you get a little bit more familiar with, strain by strain, beer by beer. So I have some that are sort of my go-to styles. The Chico for just American ales, but I really enjoy the fuller strain, that so-called ESB strain. I like the malty accentuating character of it. Been fooling around with wheat beers. I like the Bavarian wheat beer strain from Yeast. My homebrew shop doesn't carry White Lab, so I find myself using the Yeast a lot because I like to just go to the shop and support the local shop. But I know White Labs make some great products too, and a lot of the strains are the same strains. My go-to Belgian strain is the Ardennes strain. It's the Schoof yeast. And I don't know what it is about that yeast. It just makes me happy, and I think that's something about yeast that sometimes you just make those decisions based on, I just like it. It's just something that always performs well in my basement. The beers taste good. That's a yeast that I do well with. So I typically make 15-gallon batches, and I almost always buy 3 different yeasts and do different yeasts.
Do 5-gallon sub batches. So. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, in Radical Brewing, you actually dive into using a lot of unique ingredients in your beer. And I was wondering, when and how do you decide when to bring in something truly different into your beer?
Well, I think you want to think about that right at the very beginning. You want to think about the concept, what it is you're trying to achieve. I'm involved in a startup brewery here in Chicago called Five Rabbit Cerveceria, and I'm the recipe guy, among other things. And so we're the country's first Latin American craft beer brand. So we made a harvest beer this fall. We called Vida y Muerte, to remind people of what the harvest is all about. That it really is a matter of life and death for people to get the grains in. So we started thinking about, we wanted something kind of autumnal, right? So something the color of falling leaves, nice deep amber colored beer. So we kind of started out with an Oktoberfest wort. There's a lot of Munich malt in it, a little bit of melanoidin because I like that cookie-like flavor. And then we got interested in a herb from southern Mexico called hoja santa, which means holy leaf. And it's a plant that they wrap fish in to cook fish, and it has this wonderful sort of sassafras aroma. Now, the problem is it's not on the FDA GRAS list. So we can't use it because it has that same chemical that sassafras has, called safrole, that has some mild toxicity of some sort. Or at least, when they gave it to rats in massive quantities, some of them got sick. So we can't use it. So we got some, and we were tasting it, and we came up with a mix of Mexican cinnamon and a couple of other spices that really gave us this hoja santa aroma. But we used them in a really subtle way. This beer probably is about a quarter as spicy as your typical pumpkin beer. So it has just this very subtle spiciness, and with the spiciness and the Munich malt and the melanoidin, the overall effect of the beer is like drinking graham crackers. And it's been a big success for us. Turns out people really like the taste of liquid graham crackers.
Liquid graham crackers.
So, that's another thing. Whenever you can recontextualize something, whenever you can go to a flavor that people already know, it is literally hardwired into the most inner and emotional and irrational parts of their brain. And if you can go in there and pluck those strings and deliver these flavors that people already know, you have a great chance of making them happy, which is kind of what it's all about, right?
That's pretty cool.
And we all do that, because if you think about the vocabulary of malt, right? What is it? It's cracker and bread and dough and cookies and caramel and coffee and cake and chocolate and toasty stuff, and it's everything we already like. No one gets out of childhood without liking every malt flavor there is, just about. So as brewers, we have this amazing leverage over people's emotional lives that we can put those things in our beers and recall these feelings of happiness. And people are completely unaware of it, but it doesn't mean that they're not affected by it. It's very cool.
So let's switch over for a minute to the process side, though. What do
Sure.
you do? What do you do on let's say the mash, for example? What do you like to do with your mash? How do you vary your mash to fit a particular beer design?
Well, I try and keep it as simple as I can. I'm interested in getting in, brewing a beer, getting out. And but if I'm making a wit beer and I want to use the classic recipe of 45% unmalted wheat and 5% oats, I'm not going to get in and out of there real quick, because you've got to intensively mash that stuff and do an adjunct procedure. So, I look at a recipe. I think, can we make this work with an infusion with the mash out at the end? Will that do us? Generally, most people, most beers, most malts, you really don't want to be doing a protein rest anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So generally the simpler is the better. It's sort of that you want to do what you have to do, but not really anything more than that. And obviously the one big variable that you have to play with is the temperature of your main saccharification range, and manipulate that lower temperature to make it drier, higher temperature. And then once you've had that temperature decided, of course, at higher temperatures, things happen a little faster, so you can cut the time down from an hour to 45 minutes. If you're doing a real low temperature mash, you might want an hour and a half or so. Actually started doing overnight mashing recently. Had never done that before. And that solves the problem of getting me in and out, or fairly early in the afternoon, and cleaned up and onto something else. And that worked out great. I highly recommend that. So
what are you doing there? You're mashing overnight?
Yeah, I mashed overnight, just basically mashed in about 11 o'clock at night, and, put the lid on and put a big blanket on top of it, and got up the next morning, and it was, it dropped down considerably, but the enzymes are pretty well dead by that point anyway. So whatever fermentability ratio you have, it's not going to just the enzymes are not going to keep going and going and going all night, because they only have a limited life. So ended up working great for us, and then got up the next day and just reheated it and sparged it out, and I was done by noon. So
yeah, I haven't
cool.
seen that used much. Some people are doing experiments with no chill brewing, but I hadn't heard much about actually mashing overnight.
Yeah, it works great.
Interesting idea.
It's just you just split the thing and no big deal. Work fun.
So what about other techniques? What are some of the other techniques you like to roll in?
Well, I like the adjunct. I like an adjunct mash. I have this sort of modified adjunct mash that I use for the wit beers. Basically, start with a wheat and the oats ground up pretty fine. Put a little bit of the 6-row malt in.
It's unmalted wheat, right?
Unmalted wheat.
Yeah, so people know. Obviously unmalted.
Yeah. Yes, unmalted. Usually, sometimes it's flaked, sometimes it's whole, ground up pretty fine.
Yeah, the flaked, you don't actually have to do a protein rest, right? You can just dive right in.
I don't know. I don't get as much out of those when I don't. Yeah, I think they work better if you can do a proper adjunct mash and do some protein rests on them. They're gelatinizing, but they're not having any proteolytic activity done to them prior to that. So it's helpful to break that stuff up a little bit. So it's basically how they make Budweiser. That's how you make wit beer. It's the same process. And in fact, I think, I don't have proof of this, but it's my belief, and the chronology works out right, is that this Belgian brewer named Lacombre in the 1830s and 40s was actually working out techniques for creating modern scientific methods of making wit beer, because the older process was this absolutely insane, like hours and hours long process, and he modernized that process and wrote quite extensively about it. And then right about that same time, a little bit after that, Anton Schwartz in New York and J.E. Siebel in Chicago both started working on writing articles about making beer with adjunct starch in them. And their procedures were very much the same as his. like I said, I don't have a real direct link, but it seems like the Belgians did the work first, because the Germans certainly didn't care about it at that point, and the English were using sugar at that point and not corn or rice. That came later for them. So I think that's about the right chronology on there. And so anyway, that was, that adjunct procedure works great for wit beer, because it was kind of like that's what it was designed for. So you take 20%, take a fifth of your 6-row, put it in with the unmalted wheat, mash it in at protein rest, raise it up to saccharification, raise it up. You don't actually have to boil it. If you get it about 180 degrees and do 10, 15 minute soak at 180 with wheat, that's fine. Mm-hmm. You don't actually have to boil wheat. It's got a fairly low gelatinization temperature. So at that, get it up to 180, you're going to liquefy it plenty good. Then you drop it back in to a malt mash that's just been hydrated at about 90, and the whole thing comes up to protein rest again. You bump it up through the steps, and you're done. Takes about 3.5 hours, something like that, to get through that mash for me. Maybe a little bit less.
Not too bad.
It's worth it. I think I've brewed them all different kinds of ways. I think if you really want to make a great wit beer, that's the way to do it.
So are there any other techniques you like to use? Maybe hop techniques or fermentation techniques? Anything you like? Right?
I try and keep the crazy stuff to the recipes, and I've tried a lot of different things. I actually built at one point a power sparger, and I had it basically is a corny keg with a slotted pickup that went right down in the middle of it, and you put the mash in and put this slotted pickup inside, and you used hot water under pressure to basically use this corny keg as a filter to run water through the wort and into the central pickup and out. And I had done a few batches, and I got frustrated with it because I was getting a lot of kind of really stuck mashes. And I recently ran into somebody who had read that article that I'd written in Zymergy like 15, 20 years ago and said, oh, that thing was the greatest ever. I still use that. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to have to go back and look at that, because I'm getting ready to move my 15-gallon brewery over to our new brewery that we're having put in this summer, and so we can use it for a pilot thing. So I'm thinking when I reinstall a home brewery, it's going to be a 5-gallon thing, and it's really going to be optimized for speed to be able to brew pretty without a lot of attention, and to be able to knock out a batch really in a pretty easy way, just 5 gallons at a time. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as far as equipment. But I've done decoctions and stuff, and they're cool. It's definitely fun to be able to say you've done a triple mash Pilsner decoction, and it makes great beer. But honest to God, it's 6.5 hours of mashing.
It's a long time. Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. It's all day sucker, And I don't have
a lot of moving mash around too. So I said a lot of moving mash around too.
Oh my God. Well, it's 6.5 hours
of
constantly doing something. It's not like you can go read a magazine or watch TV or something. Every 10 minutes there's something that's got to happen. It's just crazy. It's cool, but there's all these Belgian techniques, all that stuff in La Cambre. I mean, these things are just absolutely off the rails. They're so insane. Yeah. And I've done a few of those, and they're really fun. I love doing them I love brewing those historical beers just to get my head inside what people were thinking and how they worked. And quite often, what looks like a really stupid thing on paper, once you do it, you realize, oh yeah, there's some reason for this. Those old guys knew some things, Sometimes it's just stupid, but I have this theory about those Belgians that the reason they did these long mashes and 12-hour boils and stuff is so they could tell their wives that, well, gee, honey, I'm not going to be home tonight. Me and the boys got to go to the brewery and brew all night, so not going to be home till morning. Sorry.
Well, now back in episode 18, you talked about your book, Tasting Beer, and you sort of talked about the importance of, critically evaluating your beer to use as a basis for sort of iterating the recipes and making the next version better. Can you talk for a minute about that?
Well, yeah, I think that's a pretty obvious thing. You can't brew it if you can't taste it. So you can't really, if you don't really have a fluent vocabulary of beer and really understand where all these flavors come from, what are the chemical processes that causes the flavors to develop in the first place? That's why it's really important to understand the chemistry of malting and especially of kilning to understand the flavor development, all these various kinds of malt flavors that come about with roasting or kilning techniques that are long or short or high temperature or low temperature or moist or dry. Once you understand the science of it, the malt kind of falls together into groups that make sense to you. You know, if you think about pale ale malt and Vienna malt, right? Those are more or less the same color. Pale ales may be a little bit lighter, but they have profoundly different flavors. And the main difference of flavor is caused by the fact that Vienna malt, when it's kilned, has a higher moisture content. And that higher moisture content leads that malt to develop a lot richer, sweeter, smoother, more caramelly flavors. And the English malts in general, and specifically the pale ale malt, is kilned fairly dry. And so it's dried out pretty well before the temperature is raised. So when it's kilned, it tends to develop a really crisp, sharp, biting, not quite toasty flavor, but sort of something that's, if it was just a little dark, it would certainly turn into that. And again, it's not that one is better than the other, but they're really profoundly different. And when you understand the chemistry of it, it really helps you know where to look when you're trying to find a particular flavor to put in your beer. One of the things I did for the new book was to send emails to 100 people I knew in the beer business, you know, guys like Sam Calagione and you know, lots of people everybody's heard of, and asked them a bunch of questions. You know, I asked the Weirmans, I asked them malt questions, and I asked Ralph Olson some hop questions, and I had some open-ended ones. And one of the things that came back more than anything else is if you got to be a good taster. If you want to make good beer, you have to train yourself to become a good taster. It's why you really should be a beer judge, whether you care about competitions, whether you're interested in judging or not. If you judge beer, you're going to be a better brewer because you're going to be more attuned to the tastes and flavors, and you know, it's just a fact.
Well, while we're on the topic, can you talk for a minute about your new book, which is the Handy Book of Homebrewing?
Yeah, so this is through Chronicle Press in San Francisco. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm you know, right at that crazy period where I've got most of it done, and I'm frantically going through and trying to figure out what I've forgotten, which is always kind of scary. But I'm trying to write a really comprehensive beginner book, but I'm also trying to give people who are not beginners some really good reasons to buy it. And one of those things is a really big focus on ingredients, and especially on recipe formulation, on really trying to understand the process of it, to how to think about recipes, how to organize your mind, how to organize a recipe so that everything works together. So that's a big part of it. Having a lot of these expert opinions and expert commentary going through, I think that's another reason people might be interested in it. And then the third thing is I've been lucky enough over the last 2 or 3 years to have a lot of travel, especially international travel. And we're finding fantastic things all over the world. There's lots of really, really interesting beers going on in Italy right now, and in Scandinavia, and in Australia, and South America is just exploding right now. There's so much going on. And so this book's going to have a real international focus. So a lot of, you know, crazy stuff and not so crazy stuff, but definitely real different points of view from around the world that we haven't really seen too much in the U.S. Homebrewing scene.
Well, thank you, Randy. I really appreciate you coming on the show, especially since I know you're in that absolutely insane period of trying to finish up the new book.
Yeah, I'm going to go back downstairs and edit some more pages before I'm done tonight.
I bet you are. Well, thank you, Randy. I really appreciate you being on the show.
No, it's great to be on here, Brad, as always. Thanks.
Once again, my guest was Randy Mosher. He's the author of Radical Brewing at radicalbrewing.com. He also wrote a book on tasting beer, and he has a new book coming out very shortly called The Handy Book of Homebrewing. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Brad.
Well, I'd like to thank Randy Mosher for taking time out of writing his new book to spend a few minutes with us today. I'd like to thank you for listening. I really appreciate your feedback. If you have any feedback for the show, you can go to beersmith.com/forum and leave a note on our discussion forum, or you can go to beersmith.com/blog where you'll find this episode, including a video of this particular episode, and you can leave a note or a comment there. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.